So without further ado or wasting time, I want to introduce our Garfield Scholar, Courtney Wade, who is going to provide a more formal introduction to our guests. Courtney?
The Garfield Institute for Public Leadership is honored to host today's panel discussion on American policy in the Middle East. Joining us today are our three distinguished guests, our panelist Paul Wolfowitz, our panelist Paul Bremer, and tonight's moderator, David Aaron. Our first panelist, Ambassador Paul Wolfowitz, has been a public servant and educator for more than 24 years. He has served 24 years in the U.S. government under 7 presidents, 4 years as U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, 3 years as the ambassador to Indonesia, and 2 years as president of the World Bank. Ambassador Wolfowitz has also served as Under-Secretary of Defense of Policy and Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Public Affairs. Dr. Wolfowitz received his Bachelor of Arts in Mathematics and Chemistry from Cornell University and his PhD in Political Science from the University of Chicago. Currently, Ambassador Wolfowitz is a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, the chairman of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council, and he also serves as an advisor on several boards, including that of the Clinton Global Initiative. During the attacks of September 11th, Wolfowitz was the U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, holding the position until 2005. During this time, Ambassador Wolfowitz worked very closely with President Bush, and he has been cited as being a driving force behind the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. Our second panelist is Ambassador Paul Bremer. His diplomatic service spans almost 40 years under 8 U.S. presidents. Several of Bremer's most notable positions include 3 years as the ambassador to the Netherlands, 3 years as ambassador at large for counterterrorism, and a little over a year as U.S. presidential envoy to Iraq. Bremer received his Bachelor of Arts at Yale University, a CEP from the University of Paris, and an MBA from Harvard Graduate School of Business Administration. Bremer also holds an honorary Doctor of Law degree from Ave Maria University. Ambassador Bremer is currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the board of the RAND Corporation's Center for Middle East Public Policy. Back in 2002, President Bush chose Bremer to serve on the President's Homeland Security Advisory Commission. Then, in 2003, the President appointed Bremer to be the presidential envoy to Iraq. His mission was to begin both the country's political and economic reconstruction. In total, Bremer is said to have ran the Iraq country for 14 months. From his service, Bremer received several public service awards, including that of the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Finally, tonight's moderator is Ambassador David Aaron. Aaron has served in both the public and private sector for many years, holding a variety of high leadership positions, including Deputy National Secretary Advisor, Ambassador to the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade, and a special White House Dental College, and his MPA from the Woodrow Wilson School for Public International Affairs at Princeton University. Currently, Aaron is a senior fellow at the RAND Corporation, and we here at Hiram are privileged to be able to consider Ambassador Aaron a friend of our college. There were several people among the audience today who I'm sure remember him coming on several occasions where he spoke his own views on the situation in the Middle East. And we are delighted that he has agreed to be tonight's moderator as well as commentator for this afternoon's panel. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our panelists, Ambassador Wolfowitz, our panelist, Ambassador Bremer, as well as tonight's moderator, Ambassador Aaron.
On behalf of the panelists, I want to thank you all for filling this room, which is no small job, and to say that what we're going to do is there will be comments first by Jerry Bremer, and secondly by Paul Wolfowitz. They each will make a comment about how they not only see the Middle East, but in some cases drawing attention to other parts of the world. And then after that, we will have a Q&A. And I will, but I will call upon the dean here of the school, the institute rather, to select the people because he wants to be sure that all the Garfield Fellows get their day in court. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Jerry Bremer.
Thank you, David. I second his gratitude for all of you being here, President, for coming this afternoon. I did a little studying of Garfield, who, of course, is not the best-known American president. What I didn't realize, and what many of you may not realize, is that he was quite a culinary expert. I read that he said once, "Man cannot live by bread alone. He needs peanut butter," which struck me as exactly right. We were asked to talk a bit about democracy in the Middle East and what the American policy should be. First of all, I think it is a very clear thread throughout American history to promote our values. I mean, our Constitution, Declaration of Independence, rather, declares that we hold self-evident that people have a right to set up their own government. It goes back to Locke and his treatise on government, where he argued that the only legitimate government is a government that evolves from the people's will. But I'm not going to talk about the theory of democracy. Let me say my conclusion. I don't think there are any people, there's no culture in the world which is not capable of self-government. I don't buy the argument you sometimes hear from people that there are certain cultures which cannot govern themselves. Like my good friend Paul Wolfowitz, we've watched this particular myth disintegrate over the last decades, including, I might add, during his time as ambassador to Indonesia. There is no country that is not capable of self-government. Now, what I want to talk about a little bit is how difficult it is, however, to get from the kinds of governments we've seen in the Middle East. You can call them dictatorships or autocracies. I use the terms a little bit interchangeably, although I realize they're not the same thing. But to get an idea, strongman government. I want to look at that and look at how difficult it is. Another thing that James Garfield said was, the truth will set you free, but first it's going to make you miserable. So I do the miserable part, and Paul will tell you how you're going to be free, like some of the people he's going to talk about. The Middle East is in a transition unlike anything that's happened in that region since the caliphate was dissolved by Ataturk in 1924. So this is a centennial, this is a 100-year change we're seeing in the Middle East. And why is it so difficult to move from a relatively centralized political system to democratic government? And I would argue because there are three important transformations. In a way, you could actually call them deformations. Three deformations that happen in autocracy. Let me talk about those three. The first one is the political deformation of society. The politics of autocracy are basically black and white. The autocrat or the dictator has the position, if you're not for us, you're against us. If you're against us, you're an enemy. And there's no place in this country, fill in the blank, for enemies. So there's no gray in the politics of a pre-free country. And gray, or compromise, is the color of democracy. But there is no gray. And so the dictator or the autocrat has to try to find ways to control the emergence of any competing political forces. Does that with the familiar ways: suppress dissent, manipulate, and encourage communal strife, as we are seeing in Syria and in Iraq today, using, as the case of the Iraqis did, a Sunni-dominated political party to suppress other groups, and now a Shia-dominated party in Syria is doing the same thing. And the result of this kind of dictatorship, the political result, is that these countries lack what I call, for lack of a better word, they lack the shock absorbers which really get between the individual and a government. What do I mean by shock absorbers? I mean the kind of informal groups that we're used to. They could be professional organizations, the ABA. They could even be parent-teacher associations. These are groups where individuals get together to express and discuss their rights short of the government itself. Now, the result of that is that this kind of country, and I can certainly say it was the case of Iraq, lacks the kind of political scaffolding on which to build a stable political structure. There are no political parties except the dominant political party. There's no free press. In the case of Iraq, there was no internet. There's no viable constitution that lays out the kinds of things that are laid out in our Constitution, the rights, the balance of power, the relationship of one part of the government, the legislature to the executive, an independent judiciary. None of these things exist. There's no rule of law. And this is important because those problems all need to be addressed when the tyrant is overthrown, when the autocrat leaves or the dictator is killed. And the result is that since the populations have not had any real experience in political life before their freedom, the immediate post-conflict political life tends, as we've seen, for example, in Libya, even in Tunisia just this weekend, tend to become a disorganized, volatile, very public demonstration way to try to influence the political outcome. Now, on top of this political deformation, there is an economic deformation. Since autocracy or dictatorship are essentially about power, the guy in charge, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Bashir Assad, the guy in power needs to get control of the economic resources of the country. And that means that monetary and fiscal policy must be put at the service of the state, and in particular of the dictator and his cronies. So you have, as I saw in Iraq, the politicized access to capital. The allocation of capital is done by bureaucrats, not by the market. You have controlled access in a similar way to foreign exchange. When I got to Iraq, there were 15 different foreign exchange rates, and depending on how close you were to the aura of power, you got a better and better exchange rate if you were a businessman. You get favoritism in tariffs and in taxes. And in the case of Iraq, the outright state ownership of the resources of the country. In fact, one of the things that is striking in both Iraq and in Libya, the main resources of the country are oil. And when the dictator or the autocrat gets his hands on the main source of economic power, the problem becomes even worse. And all of these problems, on top of the political ones, have to be resolved in some way in the post-conflict period if there's going to be representative government. Now, as if these two problems, the political deformation and the economic deformation, tell them I'll call back. As if these two were not bad enough, you also have the social deformation, which sort of follows from the other two. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the social structure of these countries, what you see is at the top you've got the dictator and his cronies. Then you have a middle class which has almost always been co-opted into the crony class. This was certainly the case in Iraq, and I would argue it's more or less the case in Egypt. And beneath them, there is a seething mass of overeducated, underemployed youth, the kind of people who made the initial Egyptian and Tunisian revolutions. But still today in Egypt, something like 40% of the youth are completely unemployed, and 40% of the people in Egypt live on less than $2 a day. So that's the bottom level. You have the cronies, the middle class, the unemployed youth, and at the bottom, the fishermen, the peasants, the farmers. Now, the result of that is that these elements of civil society that I mentioned, these shock absorbers are not there because the society is basically blown apart. And a second thing that happens with the social disintegration is a form of essentially institutionalized corruption. Everything is done by favors, and so corruption is deeply embedded in the system and has to eventually be fixed. And of course, that is also a difficult problem. Now, so that's to me, the kind of the taxonomy, that's the way to look at these countries in the Middle East and elsewhere as they move from autocratic or dictatorship to some form of freedom. Let me just say that I think for Americans, it has been unfortunate that the word revolution has been used so often in the Middle East. Not that these aren't revolutions, but because the word revolution triggers a positive connotations in our mind because our revolution worked. Actually, most revolutions fail. And our revolution worked largely because we had a very unique background. We'd been under what was, after all, a rather enlightened, even though we didn't like the king, a rather enlightened political system. The British had had a form of representative government for 400 years. Our colonies, can't include Ohio, but anyway, Pennsylvania had an elected legislature for almost 100 years by the time we had our Declaration of Independence. American colonists had real experience. We had free press. We were used to jury trials. These things were ingrained in the American culture before we declared independence. None of those things obtain in the countries that we are now, anyway, most of them, Libya, Iraq, Syria for sure. They don't have those traditions. So if you look at the French Revolution, or revolutions, depending on how many you want to count, and the Russian revolutions, and the Iranian Revolution, what do you find? You find that in those revolutions, initially, people who appear to be essentially moderates come to power. But they are very quickly swept away. Each of those revolutions had its Robespierre and its Kerensky and its Bani Sadr, and they got swept away. And why is that? Why is it that revolutions have largely failed? The reason is, I think, because revolutions are basically about power. Who, after the revolution, after the dust settled, who is going to exercise power? And that means making decisions. And to make decisions, you have to have an organization. I think my metric, I have Bremer's infallible metric to predict who is going to come out on top of a revolution. I'll give it to you for free. Here it is. The guys who are still at the table in the smoke-filled room at 4 a.m. are the guys to bet on. Now, I remember a wonderful moment in the initial demonstrations in Tahrir Square in Cairo. You remember that guy from Google, Wael Ghonim? He was very much featured in the American press, I guess, because he spoke English. But he said something very interesting right after the initial demonstrations, before Mubarak left. He said, "We will succeed because we know nothing about politics." And I said to my wife, he will not be at the table at 4 a.m. He's going to be back in his bed or he'll be out drinking. But he's not the guy. Keep your eye on the hard-eyed guys in these revolutions who know what they want and are prepared to kill to get it. Those are the guys to bet on. They're not the guys, in most cases, who are going to produce the kind of democracy that we want to talk about later on. But they are very often the ones who are going to win. Now, I cite these historical examples not because I think they are an infallible guide. As the great American philosopher Mark Twain said, history may not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes. And that's something to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Those of you who may have come to hear a debate, I guess you can leave now because there's going to be quite a bit of agreement among us, including all these titles up here. We were thinking of maybe making David Aaron an honorary Paul for the day, and then we could all be ambassadors Paul. But, it really is a pleasure to be here, and particularly to be at the Garfield Institute, which is headed by a friend of mine from years ago in graduate school, John Kortansky. And I was delighted to learn that there is a Kortansky Hall here at Hiram. And as you may have heard John say, he's slightly embarrassed to acknowledge it. Reminds me that once upon a time, Winston Churchill commented upon the man who ousted him as prime minister at the end, before the end of World War II, Clement Attlee. He said, "Attlee is a modest man with a lot to be modest about." Well, John is a modest man with a lot to be proud about, and obviously building this Garfield Institute and attracting the audiences of this kind and students of the caliber that I gather you have here is something definitely to be proud of. But he's modest about it. There's an old tale about the Middle East that begins with a scorpion and a frog meeting one another on the west bank of the Suez Canal. And the scorpion says to the frog, "I need to get over to the east bank, but I can't swim. Would you give me a ride?" And the frog says, "You think I'm crazy? I mean, you'll sting me, and I'll die. I'll die." Scorpion says, "You think I'm crazy? If I sting you, you'll die, but I'll drown. We'll both be dead." Frog is persuaded by this Western logic and says, "Okay, get on board." Halfway across the canal, the scorpion stings the frog. As he's about to go down for the last time, the frog says to the scorpion, "Why did you do that?" And the scorpion says, "This is the Middle East." Actually, the Israeli ambassador to the UN, when I was discussing with him recently why it seemed insane for Assad to be using chemical weapons when he had so many other ways to kill people, and he said to me, "Well, I was trying to speculate about motives with a former head of our intelligence service," and he said, "Ambassador, you've forgotten. This is the Middle East." So with that as a caveat, it's a bit of a caricature, but unfortunately it's not that far from the truth. Probably some of you have read about the Obama administration's pivot to Asia, as they call it, or sometimes they have a more modest description of rebalancing of U.S. policy toward Asia as the area of the world that is, and I agree with them about this, really where the future lies. And I had my own sort of personal pivot to East Asia many years ago, some 30 years ago. I had the great good fortune to be named by President Reagan and Secretary of State George Shultz to be the Assistant Secretary of State for that enormous region that includes Japan and China and Korea, all the way down to Australia, and including, among other places, which I had the privilege later to be the ambassador to, Indonesia. It was an incredible job. Previously, I'd been the head of policy planning at the State Department, and in that job, as Jerry knows, because he was in the Secretary's office, we were mostly working on the Middle East. And I have to tell you that going from working on the Middle East to working on East Asia felt like going from darkness into light, like going from a part of the world where all people could do was create problems, that's the Middle East, to a part of the world where, in recent history, mind you, this has not always been true in East Asia, but in recent history, people seem to have been doing, roughly since the end of the Vietnam War, is solving problems. It's quite a record. The Pacific Ocean used to be a very strange term for that warlike part of the world, but it seems to fit these days. So I can understand both the importance of East Asia and the desire to put the Middle East behind us if possible, but while I could leave it alone personally, we can't afford to do it as a country. So we have to try to understand it, and understanding it is not all that easy. If you'll permit me, again, this is another ambassador, Kim Beazley, former head of the Australian Labor Party, very nearly the Australian Prime Minister. He's now their ambassador to Washington. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford some years ago. He's about my age, so you can figure it was a while ago. And he was studying Middle Eastern history with a great historian of the Arab world named Albert Hourani. He wrote a paper for Hourani about the motivations of the Arab countries going into the 1973 war. He thought it was a pretty good paper. He brought it to Hourani. I guess it's a one-on-one relationship at Oxford. Hourani obviously didn't think it was such a great paper. He said, "Mr. Beazley, do you understand pure politics?" Beazley was sort of puzzled by that and said he really didn't. Hourani said, "Well, in the Middle East, we practice pure politics. It goes like this. I hate you because you're my brother, but I'm with you against father, but we're with father against the rest of the family. But with the rest of the family against the rest of the clan, and with the rest of the clan against the rest of the tribe, and with the tribe against other tribes, and with other tribes against the great Egyptian Arab Republic, unless the great Egyptian Arab Republic is fighting our Arab neighbors, in which case, of course, we're the great Egyptian Arab Republic. Unless our Arab neighbors are fighting the evil Zionist enemy, in which case, of course, we're with our Arab neighbors." To which Beazley replied, "Oh, I understand." Hourani said, "No, Mr. Beazley, you don't understand. what you have to understand is the principal enemy at 9 o'clock in the morning is never the same as the principal enemy at 5 o'clock in the evening. To which Beasley replied, well, how can you practice politics on that basis? Exactly, Mr. Beasley, exactly.
You understand?
Now, that too is a bit of an exaggeration. And before we go off patting ourselves on the back about how much more sophisticated and sensible we are than those crazy people in the Middle East, I would submit that actually, if you watch the movie The Godfather, which I think is, I don't know much about the mafia, but it seems to me a perfect depiction of the psychology of gang warfare, it is what you do when politics is a life and death matter and there's no basis, no fundamental basis for trust. And I think many of our pundits and our policymakers, because we have orderly Western minds, we like to think in terms of divisions, Arabs and Israelis, Arabs and Persians, Sunni and Shia. That's the latest thing, actually. I think you can become a qualified analyst on the Middle East at the CIA if you have some vague idea that there's Sunni and Shia in the Arab world. You don't have to know that the largest single tribe in Iraq, the Shamar tribe, is half Sunni and half Shia. So if you're a Shamar, maybe you think of the other sect as your brethren. Member of that tribe, by the way, told me that all started under the Turks because the best way to escape the Turkish draft was to become a Shia. They didn't want Shia in the Turkish army. Who knows? But if you think, very important example, Prime Minister Maliki, who is either in Washington or about to arrive in Washington, the Prime Minister of Iraq, who is definitely a Shia, and he is, I think fair to say, Islamist of a moderate kind. There's a tendency these days to interpret everything he does as a manifestation of his Shia identity. That, they say, is why he tilts toward Iran. That, they say, is why he's supporting Bashar al-Assad in his butchery in Syria. But wait a minute. It was only 6 years ago in 2007, he went charging down to Basra to attack the Iranian-backed Shia militia of Muqtada al-Sadr. In fact, he did it literally with the American army at his back. We didn't think he'd done such a great thing by rushing down there, but we were damned, if you'll forgive my French, that we were going to let him lose, so we more or less pull his coals out of the fire, and it was a great victory. Fast forward a couple of years, 2009, 3 simultaneous bombs go off in Baghdad, car bombs, suicide bombs, and a fourth one that didn't go off was probably aimed at Maliki. He accused Bashar al-Assad, you've heard of him these days, of harboring the perpetrators of those bombings and demanded that the perpetrators be handed over to him. When the Syrians refused, he asked the United States for help, and we said, we don't want to get involved in this internal dispute between Syria and Iraq. And indeed, this was at the same time, and this is not, I think we all make these mistakes, but it was Senator John Kerry, the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, was traveling to Damascus talking about how to improve relations. If you're Maliki in those circumstances, and the U.S. then basically pulls all of its forces out of Iraq, including the Air Force, that is the only thing that can stop something from flying through your airspace. Is it surprising then that when the time comes to say to Iran, you can't deliver weapons to my former enemy Assad flying through Iranian airspace when I have no way to stop you and you're here and the Americans are 8,000 miles away? It's not surprising at all. So I think, and I'm no defender of Maliki, I think he's doing some pretty awful things these days, but it's not because he's a Shia. It's because he wants to survive, or maybe, I guess, he wants to survive and be powerful. He could always step down and go into exile, but as Jerry pointed out, that's not how these people get there in the first place. They want power, but they want safe power, which means that it makes a big difference who is the big gorilla in the neighborhood. Well, looking around the Middle East today, I think you'd have to say the region hasn't lost its ability to create problems. There's al-Qaeda recovering from defeats it suffered in Afghanistan and Iraq, making a comeback throughout most of the Arab world, including in Iraq, and most ominously, I would submit, in Syria. Despite the sanctions, Iran seems to be moving inexorably toward not merely a single nuclear weapon, but toward a capability to build a significant number of nuclear weapons in a relatively short time. And the eternal Israeli-Palestinian problem, which we keep trying, I think appropriately, to solve, seems, if anything, more intractable than ever, with the Palestinians deeply divided between two governments, one in the West Bank and one in Gaza, and the Israeli public, understandably, particularly at this time, not terribly enthusiastic about the idea of trading land for peace. But finally, 3 years ago, this coming December, we got some good news from the Middle East. It started in Tunisia with a peaceful uprising. We may want to get in discussion later about how you use the term revolution. I think it's a revolution. We've seen peaceful revolutions and armed revolutions, and I prefer peaceful ones. I have to tell you, it's much the best way. Then the Egyptians, looking at the Tunisians, whom they hold in minimal high regard, said, if they can do it, then we can do it. And Tahrir Square began, I think, less than a month after the Tunisian uprising. Then Libya, where it was much more difficult, where, in fact, people knew they were taking their lives into their hands. Libya rose up against Gaddafi. And finally, I'm going to leave out Yemen because I don't claim to understand anything about Yemen. Finally, Syria in March of 2011, which means we're approaching the third anniversary of that war, not too far off. Mubarak in Egypt and Ben Ali in Tunisia left relatively quickly and easily and peacefully, assisted, by the way, importantly, by the army in both places. Interesting kind of revolution where the army manages to be on both sides of the revolution, but that happens. It happened in Indonesia, and I'd like to talk about that in a minute. But while Ambassador Bremer is correct in saying that Wael Ghanim, I think he's back in the United States, he's not in Egypt anymore, I believe, was a passing thing. It's not insignificant to me that the crowds in Egypt in Tahrir Square were not yelling death to America the way the crowds in Iran were chanting in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution. And they were painting on their foreheads Facebook, which, when I last checked, is a decidedly Western institution. The Muslim Brotherhood was not in the leadership of this, and Al-Qaeda was nowhere to be seen. And in a certain sense, it represented a rejection of the Al-Qaeda idea that it's glorious to die for the afterlife. People were willing to die to make life better for their friends and relatives here on earth, just as American men and women in our military and in other militaries are willing to risk their lives for their fellows and for their fellow citizens. They weren't dying in some belief that by killing innocents, they will get to an earthly paradise. So there was something promising there. The slogan wasn't death to America, it was Korea, which is the Arab word for freedom. But 3 years on, many people think that we're out of Arab Spring and we're deep into Arab winter. But I would say it was premature to declare Arab Spring. It's equally premature to declare Arab winter. We're in the midst of what I think is going to be a very long process, and it'll be quite some time before we know where it ends. Let me make a few points about this premature declaration. First of all, and particularly from our Israeli friends, we hear it as though, see, we told you so. It's not such a great thing. It's a kind of nostalgia for the good old days of Hosni Mubarak. Well, I don't long for the good old days of Hosni Mubarak. I think we really grossly overestimate, or rather underestimate, the damage that dictatorship and other dictatorships have done. First of all, it's wrong to think that they could have lasted. We could not have propped up Mubarak. We could have embarrassed ourselves mightily if we had supported him in the face of killing his own people. There was no way we could prop him up. I think it's wrong to think that he was such a great friend of the United States. Yes, he did certain things that were helpful to us, and I'm not saying we should ignore that or that we should spurn him when he's doing that. You have to have, in this world, reasonable relations with people who you may not completely approve of. But the Egyptian media, and these were not only not a free media, this was a government-controlled media, were constantly spewing the most vile anti-American, anti-Western, and even anti-Semitic, or maybe especially anti-Semitic propaganda. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which some of you may have heard of, it's a 100-year-old forgery by the Tsar's secret police. making out the absolutely vilest ideas about the world Jewish conspiracy. This was before Zionism. It was played on Egyptian television as though it was the truth. That was our friend Hosni. It's wrong, I believe, to ignore the hostility to the United States that Mubarak and other regimes generated. When people hate their government, as most Egyptians did, I believe, we saw that, and their government is so close to the United States and even seems to be propped up and supported by the United States, guess what they think of us? They don't like us either. Surprise, surprise. I think it's not a surprise that you find the more pro-Western Arabs in the countries with anti-American dictatorships, like Syria, like Libya. It's in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, where the U.S. is seen as extremely close to their oppressors, where people begin to hate the United States. And I think it's not an accident that Osama bin Laden was a Saudi and that his deputy, who's now his successor, Ayman Zawahiri, is an Egyptian. And there's an extraordinarily large number of people out of these dictatorships in al-Qaeda. So I think it's not wrong to say that to some extent al-Qaeda is the creation of these dictatorships. I don't miss them. Second, while there's plenty of bad news, there is good news. And I'm going to get bad. I'm not bashing the media. It is just a fact that good news doesn't sell, and newspapers have to sell newspapers. So there's bad news is news, and good news isn't news at all. But for example, not a trivial example, shortly after Gaddafi fell in Libya, a billboard went up in Tripoli and said, "Thank you for everything." It had the flags of some 8 countries, including the United States, France, Qatar, at any rate, you can predict them. And in the middle, it had the NATO flag. If anyone had said 3 or 4 years ago, there's going to be an Arab capital with a sign that says, "Thank you, NATO," you would have been probably sent to see a psychiatrist. But that happened. That was what happened to opinion in Libya because of what the United States and NATO and our coalition partners did to save the Libyan revolution. Then there were elections in Libya in July of 2012. I'm losing track of time. It was July of 2012. They had a remarkably moderate outcome. The moderate party, sometimes it's mistakenly called secular. No one in Libya is going to say, "I'm secular." They're all Muslims of one variety or another, but very, very moderate Muslims, led by Mahmoud Jibril, who had been the effective international spokesman for the revolution, got half of the party seats in that assembly. The Muslim Brotherhood, which was the dominant party, at least initially in Egypt, got a quarter of the seats, and the so-called Salafis, the most extreme Islamists, got 1 seat out of 80. I think that partly reflects the attitudes in Libya toward their dictator and the fact that he was constantly denouncing the United States, so there must be something good about us. But I think it has more to do with the fact that they understood that we had rescued their revolution. Tunisia, where there is much of the same unhappiness with the Muslim Brotherhood that led to a coup in Egypt recently. In Tunisia, they have large demonstrations, a lot of turmoil. It's not a great story, but they're still negotiating. I think you could say negotiating is an important part of democratic process. And by the way, democracy is a lot more than just elections. It should be a lot more than just elections. Indeed, elections are more a means to an end, and the end is individual freedom and the rule of law, I would say, are the 2 most important things. And even in Egypt, as depressing as it is to read the news out of Egypt these days, it is worth noting, and I found it not that easy to get this out of the news reporting on Egypt a few months ago, but there were 8 million people in the streets in Egypt demonstrating against what they saw as the imposition of a Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship. The Egyptians, people, intensely disliked what the Muslim Brotherhood was doing. And as an Egyptian friend of mine said, the Muslim Brotherhood, in a very short order, has discredited itself. For years, they could get away with saying Islam is the answer. Egyptian people have seen after 10 months, Islam is not the answer. I think it was put it mildly, grossly premature of the army to say, this is our opportunity to come back to power. But there were somewhere between 8 million and 15 million Egyptians in the streets and signing petitions demonstrating against the Morsi government. And I would encourage you to Google online, Egypt, the next president. It will take you, I think, rather quickly to a site called Free Arabs, and you will find this remarkable 5-minute interview with a 12-year-old boy at a demonstration in Tahrir Square, I think it was, a year ago, describing what's wrong with the constitution that is being imposed, or attempted to be, was imposed effectively by referendum by the Morsi government, and how can you say it gives equal rights for women when enshrines Sharia. It's really charming. And the Egyptian ambassador, whom I didn't know about this, I told it to him, he said, "This is amazing, I wish I could be as eloquent as this boy." And I mention it because I don't think he's that atypical. There's a lot of brain power in Egypt, there's a lot of goodwill in Egypt. I don't like the way things are going, but I don't think that story's over. And that's really my third point, because if you're going to think about these things, you can't think in terms of 1 year or even 5 years. Maybe you need to think 50. I would say at least 30. Our own history is a reminder that it took us many years to get to a constitutional democracy, and many more and a bloody civil war to deal with the defect of slavery. And as Ambassador Bremer said, we at least began with a couple hundred years of parliamentary practice thanks to the British. Some more recent history, I think, may be more relevant for Egyptians and other Arabs. And I want to, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, because in many ways this was, for me, a truly formative experience when I was at the East Asia Bureau. And by the way, it came as a surprise. As I said, I was very pleased. It was much better to be arguing with the Japanese about citrus and orange import quotas than to be dealing with the Arab-Israeli issue. But what surprised me when I went to East Asia and thought I'd spend most of my time dealing with the big countries of Northeast Asia, especially Japan and China, it turned out the single biggest preoccupation of my 3.5 years there was the Philippines. 30 years ago, if Arabs looked around the world, democracy would have appeared to be a privilege of the rich, largely Western countries. India was a rare exception, but most of the other poor countries of the world faced a miserable choice between either military dictatorships or, even worse, totalitarian dictatorships of the communist or Iranian Islamist variety. And then came a great change. And to some extent, I think it really did start in the mid-'80s in the Philippines, with a push from the Reagan administration in the United States. For years, people thought that the U.S. really didn't care how these dictators operated. He may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, was said of various ones. I think it was actually Somoza in Nicaragua, but it might have been Marcos. And I think Filipinos in the early 1980s figured there was no point resisting Marcos because somehow or other the U.S., probably through the devious CIA, no one's quite sure, they attribute all kinds of power to us that we don't have, but we would make sure that he stayed in power. But in 1983, partly because of the appalling assassination of opposition leader Benigno Aquino, we began an increasingly public campaign of pressure on Marcos to reform, not to step down, but to reform. And by 1986, and that's 3 years, and I emphasize that because real change doesn't happen overnight, and part of what we're coping with in the Arab world is change that is happening overnight without any preparation. That U.S. pressure had encouraged the Philippine people to organize in opposition to Marcos, and in February of 1986, February 26th, I still remember, 1 million people were in EDSA Square in Manila, and Marcos was forced to leave. To encourage his departure, by the way, Reagan said, "You can come to the United States if you want to. We won't force you to wander around the world, but it's time to leave." Arguably, that was the first, but by no means the last, demonstration in recent times of what we call people power. But it didn't end there. The next year came in Korea. For years, people said, democracy doesn't operate in a Confucian society. Indeed, I heard a senior Korea specialist tell Secretary of State Schultz that Koreans really don't care about democracy. They haven't had democracy for 4,000 years, i.e. ever. Don't fuss about it. That was 1983. 4 years later, there were mostly students in the streets in Seoul. The president was forced to accept direct elections of the next president. That was 1987. Since 1987, South Korea has had elections regularly every 5 years, and more importantly, it is a free country, and an incredibly successful one. So there went the Confucian exception. Then for years, we sometimes still hear about the Chinese exception. Chinese are different. They don't mind being ordered around. It's the order of heaven or something. Well, in 1988, there was a peaceful succession in Taiwan from the fairly tough dictator, Zhang Jingguo, who was himself the son of an even tougher dictator, Chiang Kai-shek. He had arranged to transfer power to a hand-picked successor named Lee Teng-hui, and the rest, as they say, is history. Taiwan now has regular presidential elections, and again, more importantly, it's a free country. Indeed, it's such a free country that the several million Chinese tourists that are coming to Taiwan every year now, apparently, I'm told, spend a significant part of their time in their hotel rooms watching Taiwanese television, which is full of junky political talk shows. They may be junky, but there's nothing like it on the mainland. And I suppose that's what the Communist Party would call spiritual pollution, and I'm all for it. But then came the big one in 1989. I hadn't really thought about this. Each year there was something big. The fall of the Berlin Wall. And the 1990s saw the birth of a whole series of new democracies that I never thought I'd see in my lifetime. I'm betting that my two colleagues here expected we'd see the Soviet Empire last forever. I certainly thought so. It was much more successful than expected, though by no means all of those countries have become democracies. But I often like to cite the example of Romania, because Romania was probably the most oppressive of all the East European countries, with arguably a very large percentage of the population. I was once told 20%. I think that's rather high, but 5% is high enough. Of the Romanian population were spying on their neighbors and their friends on behalf of the Romanian secret police. Well, Romanian democracy was, as they say, one-party democracy for, what, I think 15 or 20 years. But it is, first of all, a much greater degree of freedom, and finally, in fact, they've become two-party democracies. And the 1980s also saw a whole series of transitions in Latin America from dictatorships to democracy, including Argentina, Brazil, and very importantly, Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile. And then one more that I really never thought I'd see in my lifetime. In 1994, South Africa became a black majority democracy, and quite peacefully, amazingly. But my favorite of all is Indonesia, and I have to plead guilty. When you're an ambassador, sometimes you're prone to forget which country you're representing to which country, and we call that clientitis when you begin to think you're representing Indonesia to the United States and not the other way around. I hope I never forgot that I was the American ambassador to Indonesia and not vice versa, but I have to admit I really fell in love with the country for many reasons, and most of all because of its religious tolerance. This is the largest Muslim population in the world, although it's not a Muslim country. It's not the state religion. They actually, typical Indonesian way, it's not a secular state either. They have recognized 6 state religions. It's a good way to get it done. But when I was there, it was deep in the middle of its second dictatorship, a mild dictator named Suharto. In 1998, the economy collapsed, much worse than our collapse of a few years ago. 14% decline in gross domestic product in a single year, and this was a poor country to begin with, 14% real decrease. Well, that led to a certain amount of upheaval. Again, by the way, 1 million demonstrators in the street, mostly students. The military, I believe, more or less, including to some extent led by the current president of Indonesia, as a former general, pretty much said to Suharto, we can stop the students for a day or two, but we're not about to spill blood on your behalf. Why don't you just leave peacefully? And he left peacefully, not happily, but peacefully, and he actually died in his bed in Indonesia, which is more than most of these dictators are able to do. when everything happened and by the way, Indonesia is a great success story. Whether you measure it in free and fair presidential elections, they've had 3 successive ones. They have another one coming up next year. There's a lot of debate about who's going to be the next president. There's absolutely no debate at all about whether it will be a democratically elected president. And their economy is booming. I don't know whether it's cause and effect, but they're growing at 7% a year, and they've become the darling of many foreign investors. So when things first began in Egypt, I thought, well, there's some similarities here. Military dictatorship led by a long-lasting leader, Suharto in one case, Mubarak in another. And I guess I had greater hopes. And so I asked myself, why did Egypt not work out like Indonesia? At least I may eventually, but it's going to take a long time. And the answer is, in part, that not all dictatorships are alike, by no means whatsoever. And they're the kind that torture children in order to get their parents to confess, yes. There are kinds like North Korea that just arbitrarily arrest whole families because one member of the family is suspect. North Korea is about as bad as you can get. And at the other end, much milder, there was Suharto's Indonesia, where people were not afraid at all to make very critical comments in private. That's one measure of success. Where the press, though it was censored and had to be a little bit careful about saying too much about the corruption, especially the president's children, nevertheless, it was a economically, financially independent press that had to sell newspapers, and their reporters were fantastic. And I used to, as ambassador, get enormous information from the Indonesian reporters by asking them, that story you wrote, there was a paragraph I didn't understand. Can you explain it to me? Oh, yes, that's about the clove monopoly that President Suharto's son has just managed to ram through the government. Oh, okay, thank you. They had political parties. I thought they were a joke. There were 3 of them. There was a government party, which was guaranteed to get more or less 2/3 of the vote in every election through various kinds of rigging, not through ballot stuffing, but all the other things that lead up to an election, money and things like that. And then there was a so-called Muslim party that would get 2/3 of the remaining third, and then there was a so-called nationalist party which would get the others. And I thought, why do they go through all these motions? I don't know why he went through the motions. What I do know is today there are 5 viable political parties in Indonesia. Every one of those 3 is a viable political party. And the winner of the first democratic elections, in the sense that she had the plurality, a Muslim woman who later became prime minister, was the product of that smallest of those 3 parties. Makes a difference. In Egypt, you couldn't have a party at all, which is why the Muslim Brotherhood had such a dominant role. In fact, Mubarak locked up Saadin Ibrahim, an Egyptian liberal, terribly dangerous to have any liberals around, and then locked up Ayman Noor, a not only liberal, but a Christian liberal, very dangerous. So I think you can see some of the reasons within the structure of those societies why one has worked well, the other hasn't worked so well. I think a message there, though, is if we want to see in Egypt, and Egypt is no question the most important Arab country, that comes out of all of this successfully, we need to help them build the kind of civil society that should have been built under Mubarak and was built under Suharto. And which leads me to say, I think the U.S. does bear responsibility. We almost never used our considerable influence in Egypt to promote even modest or gradual political reform. I think George W. Bush was right when he said we had made a kind of devil's bargain in the Middle East. We thought if we gave up on freedom, we could get stability. Instead, we got neither. But he flinched when it was crunch time. He was in Cairo, I think it was in 2008. Ayman Noor was still in jail. He was going to mention something in his speech about Ayman Noor. I'm sure it wasn't Ayman Noor should be released, but just if the President of the United States even mentions your name, it's hugely important. And by the way, you'll hear this from former Soviet dissidents, that if they got mentioned by President Reagan or by Secretary of State Schultz, it guaranteed an extra beating from their guards at night, but it was worth it because they knew they weren't forgotten. Well, then it was announced that Mubarak was going to be sitting on the stage during Bush's speech, and guess what? They took the Ayman Noor reference out. I think that was cowardice, or, well, I don't know, that's too harsh a word. It was a mistake, let's put it that way. Then President Obama went to Cairo in 2009, and I think that speech was a mistake in many ways, but let me quote a very prominent Arab commentator, Hisham Melhem, who's the head of the Washington Bureau of Al Arabiya. He said it was a lost opportunity. Obama should have said something there about the oppression of the Arab governments, including, I think he implied, without saying it in so many words, particularly Saudi Arabia. There was a good deal of self-criticism in the United States. I'm not really against that. It may be useful. But there was not a word of criticism of the Arab regimes. Terrible lost opportunity. But it got worse a month later when the so-called Green Revolution took to the streets in Tehran. And the United States had not a word to say about, on behalf of the people who were being killed by the Iranian regime. I don't know why. I suspect it's because we thought somehow this would protect the nuclear negotiations with Iran. If that was the reasoning, it was mistaken. You don't protect the negotiations by letting up pressure on the regime. What I do know is the result was demonstrators were saying, Obama, are you with us or are you with them? And apparently that rhymes in Persian. I want to wrap up here and get to some discussion, so I'm going to skip lightly here. But look, I think the United States has a great deal of influence still. There are enormous limits on our power, and what our influence varies greatly from one place to another. We don't have the same kind of influence in China for obvious reasons that we had in the Philippines, where the president depended on our foreign aid. And one of the limits is that when we talk about the development of countries, it depends, I don't know the percentage, but 80%, 90% on the efforts of the people themselves. But those efforts, as I think the Philippine example and many others illustrate, the efforts of the people, their willingness to take risks, their willing to stand up for principles, are greatly strengthened when they see that those efforts are supported rhetorically and maybe financially by what is still considered the greatest country in the world. They may criticize our policies violently. I don't think you'll find an Egyptian who approves of American policy in the Middle East, which they immediately equate with Israel. But I think you'll find many, many Egyptians who would say, our model of what we would like is what you have in America. By the way, it reminds me, if you'll permit me, some 20 years ago, shortly after the Oslo Agreement, I was lucky enough to get a visit to Gaza shortly before Arafat arrived. We met with a group of very tough-looking young men called Fatah Hawks. I would not want to have met them in any dark alley. They'd all spent quite a bit of time in Israeli prisons, and one of my colleagues asked them, well, what's your idea, what's your model of what you would like a free Palestine to look like? And they said, well, there really isn't any country, and they proceeded to describe something that sounded to me like a couple countries I know. And I said, well, I don't mean to be impolite, but it seems to me what you're describing is a lot like the United States. And they said, oh yeah, that's exactly, we'd like to be like the United States, or like Israel. He said, the trouble with Israel is they've taught us about democracy, even in jail, by the way, but they won't let us practice it. It's a powerful idea. And I'd like to just conclude with this. It is a powerful idea. It's not just a moral idea. The so-called foreign policy realists seem to take a certain pride in saying, I'm a tough guy. I don't mind how many people are killed because I care about American interests, not about sentimentality. Well, I care about American interests. I care about them enormously. And I think American interests are advanced when we have allies that respond to us, when we have populations that want to be like us. And just think about the Iranian case. I think it was very unfortunate in his UN speech. And again, I can find stuff by Bush that's the same way, but he's not the president now. Let me talk about our current president. Both presidents put such a priority on the nuclear negotiations, they forgot about the Iranian people. If you read Obama's speech, you will say, we're not for regime change. Well, I'm not sure why not. I mean, if he means we're not planning to invade Iran, I'm all with him on that. If he means we don't want to see a bloody revolution in Iran, I'm pretty close to him on that. But what would be wrong with a regime change in Iran? It'd be wonderful, especially, I mean, if it's peaceful. He said, we fully support the right of the Iranian people, I think he used the word freedom of the Iranian people to develop peaceful nuclear energy. I was waiting for the sentence, we also support their right to demonstrate peacefully. It's not there. That difficult problem of Iran would be so much easier to solve, or at least to manage, if Iran were a friendly country, not a hostile one, if Iran had a regime that cared about its people instead of caring about spreading the Islamic revolution, and Iran that was friendly to the United States. That's what I believe is our national interest, not just our moral interest, our national interest in supporting Democrats where we can, as much as we can, which may be limited sometimes, but we should use the influence that we've got. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Now we're going to enter into the question and answer period, and we have microphones there, and that's where you'll have to go to, so the sound people and the camera people can both capture your undying words. I might take the advantage of being the moderator to sort of ask the first question, and that has to do with an article that appeared in the New York Times yesterday about the new American policy in the Middle East. This administration agrees with Paul Wolfowitz that the future lies in Asia. And they seem to believe that in order to be able to focus on Asia, we have to cut back on our commitments and involvement in the Middle East. So they have identified 3 things that they want to try to accomplish in the Middle East, and that's basically it. Those 3 things are Iranian proliferation, Arab-Israeli negotiations, and terrorism. Now, that leaves out a lot of what we've been hearing here today. So my first question is going to be, how do you all think about this repositioning of the U.S. position and approach to the Middle East?
Well, you want me to just take a crack first? Sure. First of all, the problem is the mechanistic approach, as if it was one thing or the other. Actually, it's both. Our influence and interests in the Middle East are just as strong today as they were 10 years ago, or when Paul and I were in government together almost 30 years ago. And it is a false and mechanistic approach to say, well, we can just switch our attention to Asia. The other problem with it is, when they say they want to pay attention to Asia, they miss the fact that leaving an area where we have major interests has an impact on our credibility in Asia. If we are seen withdrawing our troops, in my view, too early from Iraq, in the process of pulling them out of Afghanistan, leading from behind in Libya, sitting on the sidelines in Syria, that has an impact in Asia by itself. So that the whole question, Paul used the term, the fundamental lack of trust is an important thing for American foreign policy. If we're not credible in the Middle East, it's not very likely we're going to be credible in Asia. So there are 2 problems with this. One is the mechanistic sort of, this you dial down, this you dial up. I agree with Paul that, and with the president, that it's very important that we have more presence in Asia. Because I think from a geopolitical point of view, the major challenge we face in the next 30 to 40 years is the rise of China. We need to have that happen peacefully, and that's going to be hard. But it is going to be much harder if we're seen as effectively abandoning American interests and allies in the Middle East.
Well, I agree strongly. You're not going to get an argument between us on this. I think that the United States is a global power with global interests and global responsibilities. Like it or not, it might be a lot more fun to be Denmark, and we could just talk about how it's all going to affect us.
Good beer. Good beer.
Good beer and lots of other good things, good people.
Yeah.
But, you know, when Jerry and I were both in the Reagan administration, that administration and many others, I just comes to mind, and we were dealing with major problems in Europe with the Soviet Union, major problems in the Middle East, including Iran-Iraq war, and major problems and issues in East Asia, including how to build new whole relationship with China, Japan trade, and so forth. Not to mention, as I said, the Philippines and Korea and those things. Global powers can't afford to pivot. Regional powers can pivot. The last time that I know of that we saw a pivot was in 1971 when Great Britain declared that it was abandoning all its commitments east of Suez. Well, east of Suez basically means the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf. This was the 1970s. Some of us are old enough to remember what the 1970s were like. The United States, after Vietnam, was not about to take on any new responsibilities if it could avoid it. I remember that was my first time in the Pentagon, was in the Carter administration in the 70s, and we said the Shah will take care of the Persian Gulf for us. Well, the Shah didn't last till the end of the 70s. The 70s turned into a calamity for the region. It led to a war between Iran and Iraq that left 1 million people dead, 2/3 Iranians, 1/3 Iraqis. It led to the Iranian Revolution and the takeover of our embassy and the humiliation of the United States. It led to a brief but I guess multi-day takeover of the great mosque in Mecca by extremists who basically became the ultimate foundation of Al-Qaeda. It led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and a few other calamities. Geopolitical vacuums are not good things. And if we leave a vacuum in the Middle East, when the British left a vacuum, the United States was able eventually to step in and fill it. We leave a vacuum, I don't know if there is anyone to fill it, and the only candidate that some people seem able to suggest is China. I don't look forward to China as an ally of Iran filling that vacuum in the Middle East. So I think it's dangerous. But if I could say sort of more concrete example, if that sounds too abstract and historical, just take Syria. I think if we had stood with the Syrian opposition in the early months, especially when the killing had not gone very far, if we had stood with the Iranian opposition with President Obama's first red line, I don't know why anyone doesn't call it a red line, a year before the official red line, he said Assad must go. Now, if we say Assad must go, or if a university professor says it, it's an academic observation. When the President of the United States says it, that to me is a red line. And we've done virtually nothing to make that happen. I have to be absolutely clear. No one I know of, myself definitely included, wants to see American troops in Syria. We're not talking about that. The question is whether you help the Syrians fight for themselves. And we've seen this movie before. I would say 3 times during my career. First, in Iraq at the end of the first Gulf War, when I think we stopped prematurely, not by not going to Baghdad. We allowed the Shia to be slaughtered when we shouldn't have. Then in Bosnia for 3 years, bipartisan, first Bush, then Clinton. For 3 years, we allowed 200,000 Bosnians to be killed with an arms embargo on the Bosnians. The Serbs, the aggressors, had all the weapons. We made sure the Bosnians couldn't get any. We said each time, as we've said in Syria, well, initially, we don't have any interest. This is James Baker's famous phrase, we don't have a dog in that fight. I understand why Americans don't want to get messed up in civil wars. They're difficult morally as well as strategically. Well, after a year or two, or in the case of southern Iraq, maybe a few weeks, we say, well, maybe we have a dog in that fight, but there's nothing we can do about it. Then another year goes by. Well, there's something we could have done about it, but now it's too late. I'm not sure it's too late in Syria, but I know absolutely for certain that if we had acted, nothing's for certain. I believe strongly that if we had acted earlier, sooner, the Syrian opposition would be moderate. And instead, what we're facing is the very great likelihood of an Assad ruling over a broken country under sanctions with some significant chunk of that country controlled by an al-Qaeda allied group called the Nusra Front that the Obama administration itself has declared a terrorist organization. If you want to fight terrorism, then you better figure out what you're going to do about the Nusra Front in Syria.
Thank you, Paul. And now we're going to turn it over. I'm going to have Mr. Koryansky to come up, and he will pick out who gets to talk and who doesn't.
I think you'll be glad to join with me in expressing our gratitude to some of our principal donors, people who have contributed to the success of this afternoon's program and to the Garfield Institute generally. I have in mind specifically Michael Canty, Carl Drucker, Kenneth Moore, Mark and Ann Logan, and of course our very dear friend, principal benefactor, and contributor to both the planning of the events of the Garfield Institute as well as their sustenance, my friend and our friend, Mr. Bill Recker. All right. As Ambassador Aaron said, if you have questions, would you please raise your hand? I'll recognize you and then come to the one of the microphones.
You've enunciated that there's ample concern about whether democracy might or might not work, but I didn't hear any of the speakers talk about what it might look like. So could each of you comment on what you think that democracy might look like in the Middle East? Will it be republicanism? Will it be direct democracy? Coalition-based? What do you think might occur in the 30 years or so?
I'll take it. Let me try a first shot. We all, maybe not we, certainly myself included, too many of us, I think, use the word democracy because it's a shorthand that conveys a lot of things, a lot of ideas. And ideally, I think it would be liberal democracy with the rule of law and guaranteed freedoms. And I think, I didn't used to believe this, I think there has to be some considerable degree of economic freedom as well. However, the first thing is it's not a tyranny. For many of these countries, simply not to be ruled by tyrants is a great advance. And that's the Romanian example that I cited a bit fleetingly. It was a huge improvement in Romania to go from evil, horrible dictatorship to a one-party democracy, and a great advance in freedom. And as critical as I am of the Chinese, very critical, China today is light years ahead of where it was when I first visited in 1983. So I think the most important thing is the degree of freedom. I think you can't have real freedom without political institutions that support it, but that's the real goal.
I think the beginning of wisdom is to realize it's going to be different in every place because it's going to reflect the history and culture. And I intentionally did not use the word democracy when I was in Iraq. I spoke of representative government because there was this view being peddled, particularly in our press, that we were trying to impose an American democracy. And I used to say to the Iraqis, you know, we had this experience of 400 years under the British. Our democracy is very different from British democracy. It's not the same. So we don't have a cookie-cutter model here. The thing to focus on are the fundamental freedoms of representative government, political, economic, and social freedoms that address the kind of deformations that I spoke of. And that'll be different everywhere. And it's going to take time.
Becca?
Mr. Wolfowitz, your closing remarks about the United States forgetting about the people of Iran reminded me of a September interview you did with Jenna Lee from Fox News. In the interview, you said that our leverage against Iran is economic sanctions, which isn't much. And I was just wondering if you still hold to that, and if so, how could we improve the sanctions or improve our leverage against Iran? And then also, I was wondering if you thought that it was at all possible. In the interview, you said that we should lay all our cards on the table to kind of dismantle the nuclear program and fight for humanitarian causes? Would it be possible to handle the issue with the nuclear program and then move on to the humanitarian causes?
It's a lot in that question. Let me try
Sorry.
to tackle it. No, it's fair enough. You didn't bring up the issue of military options, and I'm glad you didn't, because I don't know how one can arrive at a good answer to that in the absence of a great deal of, an awful lot of things that are said to be secret aren't really secret, but it is very secret what the Iranians have, what we know about what they have, and what we can do about it. But I think one thing you can say without any question is that whatever you do militarily is going to be short-lived. And I mean, I consider 10 years short. I mean, and 10 years, by the way, is, the Israelis were able to slow the Iraqis down by 10 years. And we learned when we got at the end of the first Gulf War that Saddam was about a year away from a nuclear weapon. So there has to be some thought about the longer term. And I think the longer term, and this is, I think really requires an Iran that is at least not so hostile to the West. And I think that means an Iran that is also treats its people differently. One instrument that I think should definitely be used to put some pressure for a solution here are sanctions. It bothers me that sanctions usually punish the people long before they get to the government. But I think the signs are the Iranian government is concerned about the reaction of the people to these sanctions. And I think it'd be a great mistake to let up that pressure without a very, very clear deal, and I'd be surprised if we can get that. But on your question of could we do one and then later the other, I'd say two things. First of all, I don't think it improves our negotiating position with Iran to say that we're not going to do anything to make your life more difficult at home. I think, and secondly, I think the likely result, well, look what happened in Syria. In effect, we've taken a deal on chemical weapons. The big debate is this really a deal? Are they going to really live up to it? Most important thing is we now have a stake in the survival of the Assad regime. All the attention is here at the magician's hand at the chemical weapons. Meanwhile, under the table, Assad is killing more people with conventional weapons than he's ever killed with chemical weapons. I'm afraid that, in fact, if we get a deal with Iran, and I'm not against having one, but it will become almost impossible to actively support political change. It may happen, the political change may happen anyway, but it won't happen with our help.
By the way, there's a clear example of where we did both, which was in facing down the Soviet Union, particularly after the Polish uprisings of 1980 and 1981. We supported solidarity as strongly as possible, both in terms of what we said and what we did and the amount of money we sent them. At the same time, we were negotiating with the Russians, with our allies, over the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. There's absolutely no reason why you can't do both at once.
Thank you.
Courtney.
My question is for both of our panelists. After all that you have both experienced through Iraq and the coming years after, and all that you've learned from that, I see that you guys have had two very different opinions on what should be done with Syria. In an article from September, Dr. Wolfowitz was quoted saying, "Syria is not Iraq 2003, it is Iraq 1991. In 1991, we had the opportunity without putting any American lives at risk to enable the Shia uprising against Saddam and to succeed." On the other side, Bremer, you commented on the Syria situation, saying that using a metric system by the Rand Corporation, post-Assad Syria would require 400,000 to 500,000 troops. I was wondering if you guys could both elaborate on why, knowing all that you guys do know now, you believe that either no boots on the ground or 400,000 to 500,000 boots on the ground would be the best course of action for the United States to take.
Well, let me first of all be clear. I was not talking about American troops, and I made that clear. You left that out. What I said was, and it's really a point that I should have made earlier in my general taxonomy, all of these changes, the political, economic, and social changes, have as a absolute precondition adequate security on the ground. One of the reasons the Egyptian army has reappeared on both sides of the revolution, as Paul pointed out, is because they basically are the only institution that can provide security. So if you don't have security, you're not going to get the political and economic and social progress that you need. That seems to me to be an absolute rule. I mean, as Paul also said, in Indonesia, which is a great success story, effectively the army played a very important role. It played on both sides, but in the end it played a role. So I was not calling for intervention in Syria, certainly not by America. I do think that the fact that we said first that we said we wanted Assad out and then did nothing except sign a chemical weapons agreement, which means he has to stay. He, by the way, has announced he's going to run for re-election next year. And whatever part of Syria he by then controls, he'll probably win. So he's going to be around. We said we were going to help the rebels when the al-Qaeda part of the rebels was a minority. Now it seems to be growing. Our aid to them, our military aid, is non-existent. We sent them 350,000 MREs, meals ready to eat, which is, since I lived on them in Iraq for a while, I'm not sure this will be seen as a friendly gesture.
I really don't want to see American boots on the ground. I think the alternative to American boots on the ground in any kind of post-Assad situation is going to be friendly Syrians. And that's why what I have been arguing for, and would argue even today with a little less enthusiasm, but I still think it's the best of our bad alternatives, is to arm and train and organize, because just giving people weapons is only, as we've seen in Iraq, in fact, we really got going when we had generals who understood the need to fix the whole system from top to bottom. Libya, I'm afraid, is a good and depressing example. I told you the good news, that the politics in Libya, at least initially, and I think still to this day, is largely moderate and pro-Western. But the security situation is almost the opposite. And the people who are running Libya today are increasingly the guys with guns. And the guys with guns mostly got their guns from Islamist states in the Gulf, particularly Qatar. So it's not too surprising if politics is run by the barrel of a gun, that politics in Libya is not where it ought to be based on what people want. I think, on the one hand, we say Assad must go. We want him to go in theory. I'm not sure what we really want. But there's no one in Syria now to protect our interests. I think of another example, which it was Bosnia, where, as I said already, for 3 years we had an arms embargo. The Bosnians couldn't defend themselves. Eventually what happened? We sent in 60,000, I think it was, NATO peacekeepers. They were supposed to stay for half of them hours. They were supposed to stay for a year. They stayed for 10. Fortunately, the Serbs weren't in a mood to fight anybody, at least anybody their own size, so we didn't lose people, but still we had a big commitment. I think the likelihood of some degree of collapse in Syria is high, and if that collapse happens, the pressure to actually put American troops in is going to be not inconsiderable and very unfortunate. I think we need Syrian allies, and we don't have any right now.
If I may comment on the RAND study, really doesn't say that we need 500,000 or 400,000 troops in Syria. And there is what that basically is saying, and this is out of date even, is that that's the size force one would need if you were, when we were first dealing with the problem of Assad and his army and all the rest of it. Now the situation is so much more complicated, it would be difficult to even size any kind of military against not just Assad, but now against the rebels, many of whom, as you pointed out, Paul, are as hostile to us as they are to Assad. I might also add one other point that's been floating around in here, and that is our role in making democracy happen. And I think we all agree that we need to be for it, we need to be outspoken about it, that it doesn't cost us anything when we're dealing with tyrants to keep your mouth shut. But there is very few examples of us being able to impose a democracy. And the only two places where I can say that one successful, one increasingly successful, is Germany and Japan, where we completely defeated the countries and where we occupied them, and where you had this problem that Paul talks about of no shock absorbers. There was nobody ever voted for the head of the Boy Scout group. People in schools did not vote for the head of their class. There was no process in Germany whereby these kinds of democratic exercises even began. So it was a very difficult problem, but we had, up to 250,000 U.S. troops in the western part of Germany, ultimately. So I think we have to have realistic expectations about our moral objectives.
Ann? Before our next Garfield scholar asks the question, I'm going to modify my own rule a little bit so that the audience feels and so that we can actually have a genuine give and take. If any of you are moved to ask a kind of follow-on question on the basis of what our panelists have said in response to the primary question, don't be shy about raising your hand. We can tolerate that little bit of freedom.
Thank you, ambassadors, for coming to speak with us today. My question is, in a time when the president can send a drone into a country to conduct a military action with most of the American people not knowing or caring about the action, is public support and opinion of military conflicts important anymore?
Is she asking?
Let me start. I think public support is important, always has been, and particularly anything that's going to be protracted. I guess you could pick as a counterexample, it sort of, I think, illustrates the point. When Saddam attempted to assassinate former President Bush when he was visiting Kuwait in 1993, the Clinton administration responded with a very brief cruise missile strike hitting the Iraqi intelligence headquarters at night when I suppose there were only janitors present, and announced it the next morning to the American people, and it was all over. I mean, you don't need political support for that, but on the other hand, you didn't accomplish anything with it either. I think it is important. I think it was a mistake actually on Libya to say that the War Powers Act, presidents always say, well, we believe the War Powers Act is unconstitutional, but we'll comply with the procedural thing. At least that would have been a good thing to do. I think if it had been explained properly early on and with an objective that people understood, I think the president could have gotten support for action. I think it was incoherent. An example of the incoherence was Senator Kerry saying, in a moment of, I think, unintended candor, that it will be unbelievably small. Well, what's the point of it if it's unbelievably small? I was not, and I want to be clear, I don't think it was the right response. I think the right response was not to blow things up in Syria. The right response was to help protect Syrian people. We should have at least said the purpose of our strikes is going to be to protect the Syrian people, but I think even better than strikes, I'm sorry I'm a broken record, would have been to say, okay, you did cross the red line, and now we are going to seriously arm the Syrians. We still haven't done that.
The question raises a broader concern I have. Really, if you look at it now for the first time in 70 years, leading politicians of both our political parties are basically saying, it's time to come home. We're going to do nation building at home. That is very concerning to me, because when the American people don't support even an engaged foreign policy, we are left in this situation. We are, as Paul pointed out earlier, We're the global power. There's no way around it. And the global power has global responsibilities. Doesn't mean we're the policemen of the world and all that stuff, although I always ask people to show hands about people who want to live in a city without policemen. So, there does need to be some kind of international order. And we, since 1945, have effectively inherited the mantle from the British of being the global hegemon. And luckily for us, and for all of you sitting out there and for your children, we happen to be a liberal hegemon. We believe in individual freedoms. We believe in free trade. We've used our Navy to patrol the free seas the way the British Navy did in the 19th century. All of this, it seems to me, is at risk now because both of our parties are full of talk of essentially what I would call isolationism, or anyway, coming home. And I think that is extremely dangerous. We graybeards up here may not be around when the price is paid, but you are students and your children are going to pay a price. So anything you can do to encourage the American people and yourselves to stay engaged internationally is a real step in the right direction for this country.
Thank you.
Perhaps I could make use of my own freedom to ask a follow-on question that builds off the last two questions and also your answers. And it's a kind of gloomy question with regard to Syria specifically. Is it the case that we can hope for success by arming people who might be our friends ultimately in Syria with field pieces and small arms? Or is it really the case that the success of those forces would require the use of American drones and air power to knock out hard bases that the regime commands? And if that is necessary, are we in a position, as Ambassador Bremer just mentioned, domestically in this country that makes that perhaps necessary use of American power very unlikely?
Well, I'll take a first run. First of all, you used the word success in Syria, so one would first have to define what you mean by success. And it's getting harder every day. The options are narrowing. All of the dire predictions that the American government made 3 years ago about what would happen if the Civil War went on have in fact come true. And as Paul said, that it's very hard to see what we can do now. The problem of American engagement in foreign policy, whether it's in Syria or the so-called pivot to Asia or whatever, is a question of leadership. Political leadership starting at the top with the president, who at the moment happens to be a Democrat, but I'm not a partisan for the Republicans here because there's a lot of nonsense being talked in the Republican Party too about pulling out, pulling back. Mm-hmm. Unless you have political leadership of a high quality, the American people, quite understandably, are going to be reluctant to get involved in military action. Nobody wants to, we don't choose it. And in my study of history and my knowledge of the American government, the guys who are most against it are the military. They don't want to get killed. They want to do what they're supposed to do, which is protect the country and advance our interests. But it takes political leadership of a high quality to make the argument for engagement, particularly when the mood is, as it is now, about coming home. So I think it would be extremely difficult for any president right now to take significant military action in Syria. We may get there, as Paul suggested, because the situation may deteriorate so greatly and have such a huge impact on the rest of the region that we'll be forced to. But you won't get there without presidential leadership.
We're way past the point where you can get anything in Syria that would look like success. I think the question is, could you not do something with minimal or no risk to American lives, which I think is the important, that's my red line. Could you do something that would significantly shift the balance among the three forces that are operating there now, the Assad regime, the Islamist extremists, and the so-called, I think they are moderate opposition. And I think they're, I don't claim to deep study of this. I think instinctively there are a lot of things that could be done, particularly, by the way, because two of the most important countries in that region, Saudi Arabia and Turkey have both indicated a desire for some American leadership and American coordination. And I do believe it's a certain amount of pay me now or pay me later, and the price much later will be much, much worse. And I think that's the thing. Ambassador Bremer said it really just a few minutes ago. I think the thing that can persuade the American people is nothing abstract and nothing moral, but simply to say, look, we can deal with it with minimum risk to Americans right now, and probably letting the Saudis pay most of the bills. If we wait until the place blows up and there's an Al-Qaeda half of Syria that is sponsoring terrorism against the United States, we're back to Afghanistan, and then it's quite awful. And it's hard to explain, but I think that can be explained. I think it would make a difference. But I'd have to say, if I had to predict, we'll keep on our present course until something really awful happens, like the invasion of Afghanistan and the takeover of our embassy, and then, or 9/11, and then typically we've waited too long and we overreact.
Hello. I was wondering if you two could kind of talk about the speech that President Obama has just given about Syria, how he was talking about how we might have to go into Syria with aerial attacks, but how he had also promised the public that he would not put boots on the soil, but you just said that it might be inevitable, seeing that the situation is getting more and more complicated, and the backlash of that with Americans hearing a promise publicly by our president saying that we are not going to have boots taken into Syria, but how that might be unavoidable according to what you are saying.
Well, I think it's, Ambassador Wolfowitz made the point earlier, it's when you're out of government, it's very hard to make these sort of tactical military recommendations. I mean, we just don't know. I think the president certainly captures the mood of the American people when he says he won't put boots on the ground. And I'm not in favor of putting boots on the ground either, though I'm not sure that if I were president, I would absolutely always exclude it forever. It's a red line, and we've had a recent experience with a red line being crossed. And the problem with red lines, if you're the president and if you make them public, it's one thing to do it across the table with some guy. But once you make it public, you put the credibility of the United States on the line. And I go back to what I said earlier. We are the global power. And when our credibility in the Middle East is undercut, it has an impact in Asia, which is towards which we are, according to the administration, now going to bend our attention. But at the bottom of everything is the credibility. David and I were talking on the plane about how at the heart of the Cold War and winning the Cold War was our ability to persuade first our allies and eventually the Soviets that we were serious. We were prepared, in fact, to risk American lives to keep West Europe free. That was at the heart of all of the debates in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, right through the 80s, for 40 years. So credibility is the coin of foreign policy, and it should never be spent carelessly on, for example, public red lines.
I'm going to throw in, at the risk of getting myself in big trouble, just a very quick comment, and I agree with everything Ambassador Bremer just said. Credibility is also about how we conduct our domestic affairs, and we've presented a pretty sorry spectacle to the world for the last few months. And I'm sorry to say it's Republicans that I think are correctly get the larger share of the blame, although neither side distinguished itself. Well, I guess I shouldn't say who it was, but a very senior official in the new conservative Australian government was recently visiting Washington and spoke to some of the people who had led the shutdown, and I guess they thought he's a conservative, doesn't think climate change is, he has a long list of good conservative credentials. I guess they thought he'd be on their side. He read them the Riot Act. He said, you have just handed such a gift to the Chinese by this spectacle that the Americans can't govern themselves. Please, please, we need a strong United States. So I don't want to, just to be clear, this is not unidimensional, but credibility is both in foreign policy and in domestic policy, and it matters.
Let me make a comment about boots on the ground. There have been many suggestions that there is a way we could somehow support strongly the non-radical revolutionaries in Syria and not have boots on the ground? Well, one way is, of course, drones and airstrikes and so forth. But if we're going to actually help those people, and particularly not just with their fight with Assad, but they're going to have a fight with the Al-Qaeda's. I mean, this thing won't be over if Assad suddenly flew out of the country. We have to train them, as Paul pointed out earlier. And where are we going to train them? The only place to train them is going to have to be in Syria. I don't think the Turks are going to turn over. I mean, they're doing some of it, but they're not going to turn their country into an armed camp for the Syrians. So we have to put some boots on the ground. Now, are they going to be military? No, they'll probably be sheep dip CIA is what they call it. They take a military guy and they put him in a civilian clothes and they say he's working for the CIA, and then he goes off and does stuff. Or contractors. Another good point. But there will be boots on the ground if we're going to do anything to support the most moderate factions in Syria. Don't think there's another option. There really isn't another option.
Mr. Murray.
Okay, I have to disagree. I mean, I think in the case of Libya, where we said no boots on the ground, but we also did nothing, as I said, to train and we left the equipping and such training as it was of the Libyan forces to the wrong people, in my view. We had a NATO base an hour's flight away in Sicily. We could have trained Libyans in Sicily without any difficulty. I'm not so sure if the Turks thought we were serious, which is a big, big if, that the Turks wouldn't support something. They probably insisted it be hidden and covert and deniable and all of that. And if not the Turks, there are other people. But I think there are things that can be done immediately in the neighborhood, and at least it's worth looking at. And I think it's better done that way than so-called covertly inside. It's a fair point. I mean, it may turn out that's the only way you can do it, but I think I wouldn't give up on the idea that it can be done elsewhere.
Well, that would certainly be the first step.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to go back 10 years to the invasion of Iraq. Considering the situation in Iraq now with the almost daily suicide and car bombings, the conflict between Shia and Sunnis, strengthening of Iraq, considering that Saddam Hussein was an arch enemy of Iran, strengthening of Iran. Do you ever think that it was a mistake to invade Iraq 10 years ago? My second question is, what was the influence of Ahmad Shalabi? I'm sure you remember Mr. Ahmad Shalabi in the decision-making of the invasion of Iraq. And do you now believe that you were deceived, or was the administration deceived by the information or comments made by Ahmad Shalabi at that time? Thank you.
Can I answer the first one?
Okay.
You can answer both.
I don't want to answer any of it.
Yeah, what was the question? No, it was not a mistake. Obviously, we had an intelligence problem. Turned out the WMD apparently wasn't there. I believe, and I was not in government, so now I'm not apologizing for the government. I was a businessman at the time. And I believe that the decision the president made passes what I would call the reasonable man test, which is a familiar term for business community. I think a reasonable man, faced with the intelligence that not only we had, but the French, the Germans, the Russians, and the Israelis had, a reasonable man would have made the same decision. In fact, I think Al Gore would have made the same decision. So I think it was reasonable. Secondly, despite the violence, and I'm concerned about it, and I have concerns about how Prime Minister al-Maliki has conducted himself, the Iraqi people are remarkably better off on a personal level. Per capita income today is 6 times what it was before the invasion. Infant mortality has dropped. When I got to Iraq, only 3% of the people had access to potable water. Today it's a majority. I mean, you can go right down, almost any one of the women are in parliament now. They never were before. You can go down any long list of the impact of Saddam going on the people, and it is better. Even the violence. Let me give you one metric to keep in mind. The lowest estimate of the number of Iraqis that Saddam Hussein killed in 20 years, the lowest estimate I know is 1.5 million. You do the math, that's 75,000 Iraqis were killed every year of his time there. You do the math again, that means something on the order of 6,000 Iraqis were being killed every month for 20 years. Even with the very high numbers we're seeing now, we're going to talk in terms of 9,000 a year this year. So far this year, it's a lot. Almost 6,000 Iraqis have been killed. But compared to, 6,000 a month for 20 years, the Iraqi people are safer, they're richer, they choose their government, they've had 5 elections since we left. It is a democratic system. It's certainly not perfect, and there's a lot to complain about. But I would absolutely agree that I would state that, answer your first question, I think it was the right decision.
Look, it's been an incredibly painful experience for the United States, not only because of the lives lost and the money spent, but also because it took so long. And, it's, I don't know what, 70,000 Americans, I believe is the number, casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, but it was over in a few weeks. This was a 10-year experience, and democracies don't handle that well. And I think it's had some poisonous effects on our politics, for example. So I don't depreciate that at all. I do think we tend to flagellate ourselves, and that's not such a bad thing. We made a lot of mistakes, I think, and I don't want to start giving you my list. It's different from some people's. But what people leave out is the major reason it was so much more painful than we anticipated was nobody predicted that al-Qaeda was going to make a stand in Iraq. In fact, we more or less heard the opposite. There's no connection between al-Qaeda and Iraq. Well, maybe there was. I think there was something before, but that's not the important point. There clearly was afterwards, and that's why we had suicide bombings. It wasn't Iraqis blowing themselves up, it was foreigners. It's the only insurgency I know of in history, maybe there are some others, where foreigners came into a country to commit suicide to kill civilians. And they nearly won. They nearly drove us out of Iraq. But what happened? They suffered a huge defeat, temporary, unfortunately. But the surge was successful. Al-Qaeda was suppressed. I believe, but I can't, this is counterfactual history. I think the reason things are going badly in Iraq now is because we walked away. I think if we had stayed there as we stayed in Korea, by the way, Korea was an equally unpopular war and a 10 times more costly war, and Eisenhower ran against the Democrats. The Democrat wars had its origin in Korea. He didn't walk away from Korea, and I think we're all better off for it. The most important thing I would say is if you want to go back I'm not saying one shouldn't, and sort of your question's a very good question, but you can't just assume nothing would have happened if we hadn't invaded. And by the way, I would have argued for liberating the Shia and let the rest happen, but that's a different question. There was not an option of doing nothing. If we'd done nothing, what it means is 10 more years, is that what one means? Of strangling that country with sanctions that were arguably, and many people believe this, and maybe they were right, killing Iraqi babies. Saddam made sure that babies died by polluting their water supply, I think. But at any rate, those sanctions were horrible. They weren't going to last, I believe. And while, Jerry used the shorthand, we didn't find the WMD. Well, we didn't find the WMD, but we found, and if you go read the Delphi report, which is the definitive thing on this, which, if I may make an aside, the Delphi report, this is the Iraq survey group that examined WMD in Iraq. I was a busy government official, that's my excuse. I read the summary. I didn't read deep into it until the 10th anniversary. If you read it, there's a whole page describing the use of chemical weapons against the Shia uprising in 1991 when we were debating, much as they were debating under Obama, whether chemical weapons are actually being used. It turns out they ordered the use of sarin. Sarin wasn't available, so they dropped mustard. Dropped mustard from the damn helicopters, I'm sorry, that General Schwarzkopf allowed them to fly. better job, I'm sure. I think, and I'll just on that, I want to conclude. I think the worst narrative of all, and the people who perpetrated, I think, have a lot to answer for. But I think President Bush and our administration really failed to fight it, was the narrative that people lied. This intelligence, and by the way, just apropos, Ahmed Chalabi had no influence over our decision-making, and certainly no influence over our intelligence. My colleagues at the CIA practically spit nails at the mention of his name. They detested him. There was no way he was going to, and they were so proud of keeping, anyone he remotely rumored to be connected to him, like myself, out of the intelligence process. And look, I think we handled him badly. I think he was a talent that could have been used, but I never trust. Look, I didn't trust anyone in that country to do anything except advance their own interests. That's got to be the premise. But no one lied about the intelligence. Jay Rockefeller, Democrat from West Virginia, who was vice chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, had more access to the CIA than I ever had, said, quoting Bush correctly, the president says we can't wait until the threat is imminent. Well, the threat is imminent, says Senator Rockefeller. Senator Clinton said things she wished she'd never said. Everyone believed it. Maybe they were all wrong. I'm not, as I said, I think the evidence even after the fact is murkier than that. But no one was lying except Joe Wilson in accusing the president of lying. And it was a terrible failure on the part of the White House not to fight back. A terrible mistake, I think, to say that those words, which were straight out of the National Intelligence Estimate about pursuing uranium in Niger, and confirmed by Joe Wilson saying in his own report that there had been an Iraqi commercial envoy coming to Niger. There's only one thing you can buy in Niger, and that's uranium. So yes, they were seeking uranium. The Butler Commission, which was critical of Blair in England, said yes, they were seeking uranium. And yet the Bush White House said those words didn't, quote, rise to the level of a State of the Union message. Well, that came across as saying they weren't true. They were true. They should have been defended as true. Not that uranium is the important issue, but they were true. I think that argument that President lied and the country lied, that, by the way, John Kerry was referring to that accusation just the other day. It's done enormous damage. It continues to do enormous damage, and it is a lie. I don't feel strongly about it, though.
At the risk of making light of the most serious issues, Professor Bauman, you can be sure that I was not personally responsible for the language in the program, but I mean to find out who was. And you can be sure that he will be properly punished. But whether or not democracy is or was the appropriate watchword and the most prudent watchword governing the presentation of our foreign policy, that's a hard question. The Garfield Institute does exist in order to demonstrate to a public as sagacious as this one that these questions are very complex. They are questions that do require decisions to be made on the basis of informed but never completely informed speculations. And I think that this afternoon's and evening's presentation has confirmed the rectitude of that policy. So thanks again to our panelists, and I invite you to come to the reception.